Let us begin with begging forgiveness because this is our first live stream event, Zoom event, and live streaming to Facebook from some novices. So bear with us, but we have Beth tonight, Stickney, and she is not a novice at immigration law, so that is the great news. So are we still admitting people, Pam?
There's no one in the waiting room at present.
Okay. Shall we launch?
I'd give it just 2 minutes.
All right. Does anybody want to unmute themselves that is muted and sing us a song? It's always lively when we all sing together on Facebook in different times. Okay. Joy, Cartwright, Facebook. Fantastic. All right. Is anybody in there? In Facebook? 4? Okay. Hi to our Facebook audience out there in video land. Oh, right. I think we'll launch.
Yes.
And we welcome you to our first Maine Multicultural Center online forum. We were doing these up until the virus that shall not be named stopped our live presentations in the library last March. The Maine Multicultural Center is a group that formed in 2016, and we are committed to enriching our community through welcoming immigrants and diverse cultures for both the social and economic benefits that we feel this brings to our region. So in that light, we offer forums, teacher workshops, and social events for immigrant and local folk to visit. So I would like to present our speaker this evening is Beth Stickney, and we feel so appreciative of you joining us, Beth. Beth has specialized in immigration law and policy since 1986. She presently directs the Maine Business Immigration Coalition, and this is a group that advocates for positive laws and policies impacting immigrants within the business community. Many of us locally work with the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project, ILAP, which is down in Portland, and it's the only nonprofit state provider of legal aid to immigrants, low-income immigrants. And Beth was actually the founding executive director of that organization as well. She's worked on human rights and refugee and asylum issues as a volunteer for America's Watch, some of you know, and then as a legal officer with the UN Observer Mission in El Salvador. We really appreciate you coming, Beth, and we'll let you take it away.
Sure.
Oh, let me just add, if you have questions, if it's something urgent like an acronym that you don't understand or something like that, raise your hand. But otherwise, put it in the chat box, and Beth will take Q&A after about 45 minutes. Okay. Did you want to add anything to that, Beth?
No, I think that covers it. And thanks so much. And thank you all for taking a little bit of time with me this evening. And I'm happy to be your first guinea pig on a Zoom Facebook Live version of this forum. And happy to talk about a topic that is really important to Maine, to our country. And I thank you so much for inviting me. So I want to talk about sort of where immigration is headed. And to do that, I mostly need to bring you up to speed on where immigration has been and, has been moving in the last 3 years, which gives us an indication of where things may be going. So, I assume that all of you are on this, attending this forum because you're interested in immigration. And I will put right out there that I feel like immigration has been, a really important, it's the thing that sets our country apart from really the rest of the world. And has given us some of our greatest strengths, and is really a big part of our history and should be a big part of our future, because immigrants today, just like immigrants over the centuries, are making huge contributions to our communities and to our economy as our friends, our neighbors, sometimes even, our family members, as consumers, as taxpayers, as workers. We wouldn't be the country that we presently are without the centuries of immigration that we have had. And generally speaking, immigration law, at least since 1924, has been a creature of Congress. Congress is the body that is supposed to make the laws. We have had sweeping changes in the last 3 years, all of which has been done without involving Congress at all. And Congress, quite frankly, has abdicated its responsibility for a very, very long time. And which is proving to be tragic. And we hope that at some point they will get more involved. But at the moment, the changes that have been happening in the last 3 years have been done through various means. Changes just in policy memos that affect internal procedures at the State Department or at the the various immigration agencies, executive orders, presidential proclamations, administrative case law, changes to rulemaking, even changes to personnel. And as a result, there have been the changes have been fast and furious. It is so hard for lawyers specializing in immigration to keep up, let alone anybody else. There have been well over 400 changes in the last 3 years, all of them having fairly substantive impact. So I can't obviously capture all of them, but I will try to capture some. And I am just going to spend a little bit of time on terminology, just because there are some terms that I'm probably just going to use repeatedly, and to save you all from asking, what do you mean by that? The first thing is, as Nancy mentioned, I do use acronyms all the time without even realizing I am doing so. So if I throw out an acronym, do go ahead and interrupt, try to interrupt. but common ones I will be using are USCIS, that's US Citizenship and Immigration Services, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and I might use BIA, which is not in this case Bureau of Indian Affairs, but is indeed the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then another set of terms, immigrants and non-immigrants. From an immigration lawyer's perspective, an immigrant is a person who comes to the US with the intention to remain permanently. And typically I will be talking about people who have their green cards. Refugees are actually a subclass of immigrants, technically, but when I'm talking about immigrants, I'm talking about people who are going to be permanently staying and are on the path to, green card and citizenship if they choose to become citizens. When I talk about non-immigrants, that means people who are coming on visas issued for a temporary duration and purpose. So that's, for example, tourists, students, temporary workers. So that's the difference between immigrant and non-immigrant. And then I will mention, refugees and asylees. Both refugees, you all probably already know this, but in case you don't, both refugees and asylees are people who have convinced the US government that they either have been persecuted in the past or they have a well-founded fear of persecution in the future based on their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The difference between a refugee and an asylee is a refugee has convinced the US government that they fit into that definition when they're still outside the US and they enter the US with a refugee visa, and after a year of presence here, they're allowed to apply for the green cards. An asylee is someone who gets here some other way. They could come as a visitor, they could come as a student, they could come over the border with no papers whatsoever. And they apply to be recognized as a member of that definition while they're inside the US. And so those definitions being covered, moving on to some of the changes. And clearly, many of the changes you all know of because the media has reported about a lot of them, but then there are a lot that you might not know of. So I'm just going to start by sort of categories. So one of the earliest changes was in what we call interior enforcement, which is ICE controls interior enforcement. CBP, Border Patrol, controls the border and in theory anywhere 100 miles, air miles from a border. Under the Obama administration, while everybody knows that Obama deported more people than just about any president in the last several decades, the focus was on immigrants who had criminal convictions. And in February of 2017, that changed to go back to anybody was fair game for enforcement. So how that was reflected is if ICE had a warrant to arrest somebody who lived at X address at some point, and that was the address that they had, and that person had a criminal history. If they went to that address under the Obama administration and the person who lives there says, I don't know this person, I've lived here for the last 2 years, I've never heard of this person, even if that person was, for example, Latina, instead of then saying, well, so what's your status? They would say, okay, thank you very much, and leave. And I will say that was new with the Obama administration. For all my prior time practicing, that is not what happened. So the current administration returned to the prior policy of saying, oh, well, Jose isn't here? Well, what's your name? And what's your status? and then taking that person into custody, even if that person was in fact out of status, even if that person had no criminal history, and even if they could see that there were 3 children, small children in the house. So, the discretion to say, we're just going to look the other way on you, was removed. Another thing is, there has been a thing that is not codified in any law, in any statute, but it was a decades long-standing procedure of respecting what we call sensitive locations, which means having ICE not go to churches or to hospitals or to schools or to courthouses. And they haven't completely thrown sensitive locations, the prohibition on going there out of, off the books, but they in fact are in certain cases going to sensitive locations. For those of you who are of, at least as old as I am, when you think back on the sanctuary movement back in, during the wars in El Salvador and Guatemala, et cetera, and the number of churches that provided sanctuary to people from El Salvador and, from the Northern Triangle countries, the reason why that worked in part was because there was this sensitive locations tradition. Moving to border enforcement, this is the area where you all have, are probably already pretty well aware of what's been happening. So particularly on the southern border, increased use of detention, the infamous family separation policies, a thing called metering, where people were trying to enter legally at a border point, inspection point, and then the border officers would only allow a certain number to come to the border each day in order to say they wanted asylum, which led to people waiting for months in terrible conditions, and they're still waiting in terrible conditions in border towns in Mexico in order to try to make their claim for asylum at the border. And that is actually one of the things that led to the asylum seekers that you all read about or perhaps interacted with, who came and were staying at the expo last summer, was that there were all these folks who had come from Angola and the DRC predominantly, who tried to apply at the border post, and they were given a number and said, we'll call you. And after waiting for months, they basically gave up hope that they would ever be called, and started crossing over the river. And when, some of them were able to successfully cross the river and get in, then others were like, oh, wait, they made it across. Well, we'll do that too. Most of the people, I helped do the intake of those folks when they were at the expo, and most of the people that I spoke with had been waiting at least 2 months for their number to be called. I spoke with one person who actually did wait until his number was called, and he waited for 3.5 months before he was called. So metering is just, trying to dissuade people, trying to get them to give up. And putting, and many of them have had their lives at risk while they're waiting. The other thing that's been in effect for quite some time now is the Remain in Mexico policy, which is where people are, when they apply for asylum, they're forced back to wait for their hearings. They're forced back into Mexico. That is unprecedented. It is arguably against international law and US statutes. Litigation on that is ongoing, but the courts allowed the policy to be implemented while the litigation continues. Another thing is calling the Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, safe countries, and then pressuring those countries via trade, aid, and visa issues pressuring those countries to take asylum seekers arriving on our border and say that they will process them in their country. So for example, a Honduran who arrives at our border being sent back to Guatemala to apply for El Salvador in Guatemala. When they first started implementing this, Guatemala had only 2 asylum officers in the country, and really no well-developed asylum program, and is definitely not regarded by the international community as a safe third country. But that is something that has been going on. Another policy was saying that anybody who passed through a third country on the way to the US, which means basically anyone except somebody who is from Mexico, would be prohibited from applying for asylum unless they could prove that they had applied for asylum in one of the countries they passed through and had been turned down. So, you know, there are many more changes at the border, but those are just some of them. Since COVID, basically the law has been thrown completely out the window. There's no pretense of following the law. They are not letting anyone in. They're returning them without giving them any due process at all, which is resulting in people crossing over again and again and again, hoping to get lucky, some of whom have gotten lucky. But is, you know, again, contrary to US statutes and international law. The other thing is they're also sending unaccompanied minors back, which there are special laws to protect minors, and those are being disregarded. And you've probably read about the minors being kept in hotels for a bit, and then they're shipping them off. So, and then moving on to sort of a different category are changes that make procedures more expensive and daunting, and can discourage immigrants and non-immigrants alike from pursuing immigration benefits that they're eligible for. Examples include the State Department has reduced the length of visas. So somebody who was, for example, even from a well-to-do, you know, family, who applied for, you know, a visa and has in the past been getting 10-year multiple entry visas, they're now cutting them down to 5 or 2 or even 1 year, and making people apply repeatedly, which is not only inefficient for the State Department, but also expensive for the applicant, and you know, also entails, you know, consulates. There sometimes is only one consulate in an entire country, and so to apply again involves travel, especially because another change is they are now requiring interviews in all cases at the consulates. It used to be, again, say you were, you know, 65 and you'd had for the last 3 decades 3 10-year visitor visas. If you were applying for your 4th, they could they had the discretion to waive the interview and say, this person's been fine. We don't need them to come for an interview. We'll do it by mail, the whole process by mail. Now that person will have to come for an interview. Same thing for employment-based visas and for students. They will have to go for interviews. Again, that slows down the volume of work the State Department can do, and it is just, you know, really inconvenient for people. At USCIS, same thing. They are requiring interviews in all cases, even in cases where that wasn't needed before. They're sending requests for evidence they already have. So, for example, a research scientist at IDEX is renewing their work visa. They're in the same position. They're working for the same employer. It's just getting an extension. Normally, you would have to send in minimal evidence about what the job entails because it's the same and they have all that evidence already. Now you have to do the whole full-blown thing, and if you don't send all that evidence in, they will send a request for evidence, which again slows the whole process down. A new thing is, this has just been in the last half year, starting to reject any forms that don't have all the blanks filled in, which really trips up people who don't have lawyers, because at least lawyers now know about this, but somebody who doesn't have a lawyer doesn't know. And so what that means is, for example, say I have to fill out biographic data on a form, and it asks how many children I have, and it has space for 4 children, and I only have 1 child. So I fill out, you know, the name, the date of birth, the place of birth, country of birth, address where they are now, for the 1 child. And then I don't have any more children, so I skip to the next section of the form. That, for my entire career, has been totally fine. Now you have to write none or not applicable for child 2, child 3, child 4 on the form, and not just, you know, no other children, and then skip the date of birth, place of birth for the non-existent children. You have to fill out every blank. So NA for date of birth, NA for place of birth, NA for, you know, country of nationality, blah, blah, blah. I mean, really absurd, and leads to people getting applications rejected, which can lead to them missing a filing deadline and then losing their status. So it's not just annoying, it's also can be very consequential. New asylum rules that took effect, work permit rules that took effect August 25th, that for people applying in front of USCIS will mean that instead of waiting the already bad enough 180 days before they're eligible to get a work permit, they will not be able to get a work permit till 1 year after they filed their asylum application. And for people who arrive in the US, and at the moment with COVID, people aren't arriving in the US for the most part, but if COVID, you know, hopefully goes away at some point, if people are crossing over the border, like for example, the asylum seekers who arrived last summer did, without a visa, anybody arriving after August 25th will never be able to get a work permit while they're pursuing their asylum application. Just no work permit at all, no ability to work legally for an employer at all. Another very recent thing, recent rule taking effect actually on October 2nd, is the USCIS fees are going to be going up. So to apply for a work permit, that's going up 34%. Applying for a green card within the United States is doubling. Just about. Applying for naturalization is going up 83%. So, you know, pricing people out of the ability to pay the fees. You know, obviously low income people are much more affected by this than others, but it will have a real impact on people's ability to actually file for applications. And also asylum seekers will have to pay for their work permits for the very first time. They've always had to pay for their second or third work permit, but their first work permit was always free. Now they will have to pay the fee. They also will have to pay $50 to apply for asylum. In the immigration court, the judges have had the control taken away from them to control their calendars. They're being pushed to decide all cases within a year, and they're not allowed to administratively close a case. So, for example, somebody who is an asylum seeker and ends up in removal proceedings, and during the long backlogs ends up marrying a U.S. citizen, and could then apply for their green card based on that. Judges in the past could actually close the case so that they could apply for the green card in front of the U.S. in front of USCIS. Now judges are no longer allowed to do that, which is inefficient for the court. It's much more stressful and expensive for the people. So that's just some of the sort of procedural changes. Changes that directly affect who can enter the US or immigrate. The very first week of the Trump administration, you all are probably aware of the travel ban that was created and banned people from mostly Muslim countries. That went through several iterations and was finally upheld by the Supreme Court in 2018. And then effective February 2020, several more countries were added. So there are now 10 countries from which no immigrants can get in unless there's a national interest in having them here. That includes, for example, Somalia. So when you think of Maine and our large Somali population, basically for the past 3+ years, Somalis living here have not been able to get their immediate family members, such as their parents or their spouses or their adult children, into the United States. The refugee ceiling was lowered. In FY 2016, there were 85,000 refugees admitted to the US. The first year that this administration was able to set the ceiling, they lowered it to 45,000. That was the lowest ever in the history since the Refugee Act of 1980 was enacted. The following year, it was lowered further to 30,000. This year, it was lowered to 18,000. As of September 18th, just a little over 10,000 refugees had been admitted to the US. Only 40 have come to Maine and been resettled in Maine this year, which compares to 650 refugees resettled in Maine in FY 2016. The DACA rescission, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that the Supreme Court struck down that rescission in June. The USCIS is refusing to comply with the Supreme Court's order, which is just kind of shocking to me still. And that's 700,000 people who had DACA, who still don't know whether they're ever going to have a path to permanent status. And there's over 1 million others who would be eligible for DACA if they were able to accept, if USCIS was accepting new applications. Termination of temporary protected status for Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Hondurans, Haitians, people from Nepal and Sudan. The courts have had blocked those terminations. Just about 2 weeks ago, a court allowed the terminations to go forward on El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Sudan. The plaintiffs are appealing, so hopefully that will get blocked again. But we're talking another 400,000 people there who are impacted. The public charge rule, I don't know if y'all have heard about this. There was a fair amount of press about it, but it wasn't sort of universally covered. The public charge ground of inadmissibility, when somebody is applying to enter the United States, they have to prove that they're not inadmissible for some reason. And that public charge is one of the oldest grounds of inadmissibility that we've had. It's existed since, in some form or another, since the 1880s. This rule, though, is targeted at keeping immediate family immigrants out. It basically creates a bunch of new factors that make a person that are considered to be heavily weighted negative factors, and only heavily weighted positive factors will overcome that. And the heavily weighted positive factors having a household income, yep, I see that, thanks, over 250% of the federal poverty guidelines, which 42% of Americans don't have an income that high. That's 65,500 for a family of 4. And the basically what it creates is an English language test, an education test. If you're under 18, that's a negative factor. If you're over 61, or if you're 61 or older, rather, that's a negative factor. Just a whole lot of new criteria. Since COVID-19, we've had several changes. COVID-19 has been used as an excuse to push through a lot of things, I think, on the wish list. So since April 24th, virtually all immigrants except for immigrant investors have been barred from entering the country. On June 24th, that was supposed to be 60 days, and on June 24th, that was extended to the end of the year. On June 24th, also, most foreign workers on non-immigrant visas were barred, including professional level immigrants, unless they're working in healthcare, and H-2Bs, the non-agricultural seasonal workers, are barred unless they're working in food supply, the food supply chain. So, you know, people working in summer camps, J1s working in summer camps, people working in landscaping and construction could not get in this year. International students, if their college has gone all remote, if they're already here, the government backtracked and said, okay, they can stay. If they were coming over for their freshman year, they are not allowed in. And even if their school is going hybrid, if they're going to be taking more than 3 credits online, they won't be able to get in. Then other changes impact the quality of life of immigrants. So there's rules to take work permits away from spouses of professional workers, there was a change blocking an expedited naturalization procedure that existed for active duty immigrants in the military. Just last week, a court blocked or ordered the government to start allowing these active duty immigrants in the military to be able to naturalize quickly again. But for 3 years, essentially, they've not been able to do that. A new denaturalization office. There is so little fraud that in the process of getting to the point of naturalizing to become a US citizen. There's so much vetting that has happened along the way that it's extremely rare. But a denaturalization office was set up to try to ferret out people who might have committed fraud somewhere along the way in their process, which basically serves as a signal to immigrants that even if you become a citizen, you're not safe. You don't necessarily feel secure in your status here. Proposed rules coming up. There are proposed asylum rules under consideration that would basically make virtually no one eligible for asylum, including one that says that if you come from a country or you pass through on your way here, a country that has a pandemic going on, you are not eligible to apply for asylum. So that pretty much rules out whoever was left, you know, from the other asylum proposed rule. It pretty much rules them out. A new biometrics rule will basically, it's a huge data capture. Anyone connected with an immigration application, so a US citizen filing for their spouse, the in-laws of that US citizen who are filing to be a joint financial sponsor for the spouse, would have to submit not only their fingerprints and signature and photograph as required under current law, but also their iris and voice prints, and in many cases DNA. And then the government is saying they can call immigrants at any time until they're a citizen to do their biometrics again, even though the proposed rule says that they will of course be maintaining the biometrics electronically, so they could reuse them. And if they don't show up, which is a possibility, if immigration sends the notice to an old address, their green card can be revoked because they missed the biometrics appointment. And they say they need to do this because they need to be able to continuously vet immigrants. Once again, sending a message that immigrants are somehow prone to criminality more than we are, which all the data shows is not true, etc. So there's very much an otherizing going on today, in immigration policy today. The result of all of this is, we've seen huge drops in the number of immigrants coming to the country, and people around the world are voting with their feet and starting to go elsewhere. So again, the refugee numbers have dropped. The public charge rule, which is being challenged in the courts, but the courts have allowed the rule to be implemented. We haven't seen its full effects because since April and COVID, no immigrants are getting in. And they're not even being processed for visas, etc. But the public charge rule is anticipated to reduce family-based immediate family immigration by probably 60%. And that's 2/3 of all immigrants who come here. And so, and even before that took effect, by the end of FY 2019, which was September 30th of last year, the number of immigrants arriving, new immigrants since FY 2016 had dropped by 13%. It's anticipated that by the end of this year, the number will be 49% below where we were in FY 2016. The result of this is, the world is watching. International travel is down. We're the only long haul country that has seen declines in international travel each year since 2016. This is talking pre-COVID, because of course international travel isn't really happening with COVID. Businesses can't get the talent they need. So, the tech companies, they are starting to move their headquarters to Canada, and they're offshoring jobs to other countries because they can't get the talent they need admitted to the US. International students, the US has seen a 10% drop since the 2016-2017 academic year in international students coming to higher ed and grad schools, while Canada in the same time period has seen anywhere from 17 to 20% increases each year in international students. And Canada has surveyed their international students and asked them for the top 3 reasons why they chose Canada. And 2 of the top 3 reasons are that they felt like Canada was a safe country for immigrants, and that Canada was a welcoming country for immigrants. And losing international graduate students particularly is hugely consequential economically, as is losing international travelers, because they are responsible for $37 billion annually in revenue and support 450,000 jobs. But also, more to the point, the majority of the graduate students in this country who are in STEM fields are international. So we're talking electrical engineering, 82% of grad students are international. Mechanical engineering, 62% of graduates are international. Computer science, 73% of graduate students are international students, and on and on. They are our inventors, our creative minds of the future, and they're not being allowed in. So this is, and at the same time, as we know, not just Maine is old, the whole nation is old. We just happen to be leading the nation and being the oldest. And fertility rates are at their lowest levels since tracking began in 1909. And the Brookings Institute is estimating there's going to be a drop off of at least 300,000 births in the next year because of COVID. And apparently quarantining at home doesn't translate into more babies. They're saying that the economic uncertainty, et cetera, is going to lead people to postpone having children. So, we need people to keep our communities vibrant and our economy vibrant, and they have to come from somewhere, and they're not going to come by us birthing more babies, and we need to get them from other countries. But this administration is clearly showing it wants to close the door on immigration. They campaigned on it in 2016, and they have absolutely made good on that promise. So I will close here and just say, if you care about the future of immigration, you need to vote. And even if you're a solid Bernie supporter, you have to vote for Joe Biden, because the future of immigration, and I think the future of our country, it's at stake due to so many different other, different issues, but immigration is one of them. And so with that, I will stop talking, and I'm happy to take questions. Or we can just end early. I think you're on mute.
We have a couple questions in the chat. If somebody wants to ask a question, they could raise their hand, or they can let us know in the chat that they have a question. Barbara wants to know, what's the chance of a person on a spousal visa? What's the chance that they can get a change of status to a student in 1 year?
I'm not sure I'm not sure what you mean by spousal visa. Can the person who wrote that, yeah, I see that from Barbara. Barbara, can you say what you mean by that?
I have a student from Iran that is here with his wife. His English was not good enough when they came to be admitted to the university. However, he's spent the past year studying English, and he's been accepted conditionally into the grad school program, but he has to get a change of status in order to attend because he's here on a spousal visa.
Okay. So he's studying.
I mean,
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that. It would be, because if he came in on a visitor visa, there's no such thing as coming in on a spousal visa. If he came in on a student visa, and was the spouse on that student visa, he's already got the student visa and doesn't need to, he'd have to get his own documents from the university to have one for him, as opposed to his spouse. But so what's the status of his spouse?
So he wants to get a student visa so he can attend the university.
Right, but what's his spouse's?
Call it a spousal visa, right? Because his wife is a student and he's just with her.
Yeah, so he just needs to. It's not.
So,
He just needs to get the documents. He needs to get documents from the place where he intends to study, showing that he's capable of paying the tuition and that they have accepted him. So the conditional acceptance, they'll have to give him, something so that he can actually apply, for his own.
He just needs to change his status.
Yeah, he should, you could email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I can refer. He needs to talk to an immigration lawyer to help him do that.
Okay.
And it wouldn't be me doing that, but I can. I'll put this into. Can you see the chat, Barbara? Are you Barbara or Barbara West? You're Barbara.
Barbara. Yeah.
Actually, I'll put it into everybody just in case anybody wants it. And okay. So I see Heretier has a question as well. And hang on though, I can't really talk and type at the same time. I'm sorry. Challenge. Okay, there's my email. Let's see. Given that the first work permit for asylum applications is no longer free, can applicants still apply for fee waivers? You know, honestly, the fee waiver, I have a document that the fee waiver stuff is so complicated, it's all over the place. My recall is that they cannot ask for a fee waiver, but I'd have to double check. It's been eliminated for many categories where traditionally it was allowed. But don't hold me to that. I'd have to double check it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And hi. Then will the anticipated new composition of the Supreme Court checkmate many of the legislative changes that a different Congress, checkmate many of the changes that a different Congress might implement? You know, that's a good and depressing question. Thanks, Dennis, if I wasn't depressed enough already. It's really hard to say. It depends on how Congress crafts the laws. Yeah, it just depends on how they craft it. I mean, right now, the challenge is that we have an executive who is, doing things that are in violation of existing statutes. And my bigger worry is the other direction. If there is a second term for this administration, that we're going to have a court that won't strike down things that really should be struck down. So we'll see. Is it still possible with all these new rules to sponsor immigrants? Sponsoring is a term that is really super vague. From the standpoint of, as an immigration lawyer, when I think of sponsor as the affidavit of support sponsor. So in family-based immigration, where the petitioning U.S. citizen or permanent resident has a income that is not above 125% of the federal poverty guidelines, which is the existing law that has existed since 1996. They need a joint sponsor to say that they're willing to basically ensure that the new immigrant won't be getting any public benefits. And so, yes, it is still possible. If this new biometrics rule goes through, for the favor that you're doing the actual family member who is petitioning for their immigrant spouse or parent or child or whatever, you will, for that favor, you will be repaid by having to hand over all your personal data, including not just your financial data, which you already had to do, but also your iris, your voice, your fingerprints, your palm prints, to the federal government. And otherwise, though, sponsoring doesn't really exist under our immigration laws, unless you are a family member who is eligible under the law to petition for your immediate relative, or you're a refugee or an asylee petitioning for your spouse and children who you might have left behind, or you're an employer who is sponsoring an employee or future employee after having jumped through the hoops with the Department of Labor to prove that there's no qualified U.S. worker to do the job. So I hope that answers your question, that the existing forms of sponsor, yes, can still sponsor.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So with what you said, so the
it's still the sponsor is for the immediate family members. That's first. And the immigrants, they should pass the public charge rule first before they can be admitted to the country, right?
Yes, immigrants do need to get over the public charge hurdle before they can be admitted to the country. And the State Department has a separate rule from the rule that governs USCIS, but they actually started upping the ante to overcome the public charge rule before this new rule came out. You know, there's a little bit of variance between how things are applied when people are outside versus when people are applying from inside the U.S. But right now, since the U.S. consulates all shut down during COVID-19, and they have been reopening gradually since June, but they are not all reopened yet, and they're not necessarily scheduling interviews yet on immigrant visas. So it's you know, it's to some degree, this is at the moment of this COVID moment, it's almost a moot point, but not entirely. So Biden's policies, what are Biden's policies on immigration? He has, during the primary, or early on in the primary, he had not fleshed out his policies quite as much detail as, say, Bernie had, but he's provided more detail at this point. Suffice to say, he will be much better if he's elected and if he's got a Congress that he can work with. And so, you know, he does favor crafting a path to legalization for the undocumented in this country, you know, the estimated 10.5 million. He favors creating a path to legalization for DACA, for TPS folks. There are some things that he could change right away, and has vowed that he would do so within the first 100 days, such as he would roll back the travel bans. Not necessarily the COVID travel bans are one thing, but the travel bans affecting people from Muslim countries, etc. He would roll those back. Some of the rules that have taken effect, like the asylum work permit rule, because it became final, his administration is likely going to roll that back, but they actually can't just say, poof, that's gone. They have to actually go through the notice and comment procedure required for rulemaking in order to undo that rule and several other rules that have taken effect. But it would be a much brighter day for immigrants around the country if he were elected, just because some of these executive actions can be changed by the stroke of a pen. And to have a president that wants to work with Congress to improve our immigration laws would be welcome. But the Obama administration wanted better immigration laws as well, and they didn't have a Congress that they could get the laws through. First, it was it alternated between the Senate was open and the House wasn't, and vice versa. So it will really depend on the makeup of holding the House, and ideally taking the majority back, or really narrowing the majority in the Senate, the Republican majority in the Senate. Sarah Gideon, I will say Barbara Taylor from ILAP is on, and she very nicely, thank you Barbara, answered Retier's question and said that the fee waiver is eliminated for everyone. Except for certain domestic violence and crime and trafficking victims. and some TPS folks. But so there is no fee waiver for asylum seekers for their first work permit, which is what I thought was the case, but apparently is, unfortunately. Sarah Gideon's policies on immigration. Sarah's pretty silent on immigration. Yeah, I don't know her policies. She's also been very silent about the fact that she is a child of immigrants, you know, Armenian and Indian. I think that's something that that she hasn't felt like needs to be part of her positioning. So if anybody else on this forum knows her positions, I'd be happy to hear them. I think, she's been supportive of legislation at the State House that is helpful to immigrants, such as LD 647, that would expand funding for adult ed, ESOL, and combined ESOL job skills classes, and a few other things. So I'm assuming that she would be, good on immigration. I just have not ever had a conversation with her about it. And I haven't seen her any position in writing. Let's see, pending asylees. This is a fairly technical question. Let me see if it's worth taking into account the first in, first out and the decrease in the numbers of non-immigrants coming into the country. Does that mean expediting the cases backlog? So for asylees, they are still using not FIFO, first in, first out. They're doing last in, first out. The backlog of asylum cases is enormous. Immigration has said it's about 500,000, 500,000 in front of USCIS. If they're really not letting anybody in, that means yes, people coming in on visitor visas and then applying for asylum, that means that new cases, there will be fewer new cases for them to need to try to handle very quickly under last in, first out. So yes, in theory, that might mean that they would start, attacking the backlog. But I think the backlogs are still going to be particularly long, especially if USCIS once again threatens to furlough its employees as it did, through July and August, and ended up not following through on. And they said they won't furlough, do a mass furlough of their employees for the remainder of this year, but they didn't make a promise as to next year. So why are immigrants from Latin America required to wait longer than immigrants from Africa for the same benefits? I'm thinking specifically of unaccompanied minors who have applied for special immigrant juvenile status, waiting to get their work permit, but I understand that this reflects a broader attitude towards Latinx immigrants. I don't know that that's actually true. If Barbara knows anything, I'll let her chime in. But on special immigrant juvenile, I mean, there's so many things that are taking a really long time. And that, I didn't mention that in my remarks, but I mean, one of the things that has been happening is everything has slowed down. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been waiting for their naturalization interviews. In some cases, it's now taking over 2 years to get an interview. The average time frame was, 6 months at the end of the Obama administration. It's now more than 10 months across the country, the average, with, places like Maine being faster and pulling down, making it a shorter average. Everything is taking a long time. And, to the extent that things taking a long time inconveniences and, at best, and it creates extreme hardship at worst, I personally think that's by design. Or at least it certainly doesn't bother the government that may be the impact. Somebody asked if I'm familiar with Lisa Savage's positions on immigration. I confess that I am not. I've been paying attention to the candidate who I feel like actually has a chance of unseating, our current senator, in terms of leading the positions. And I have not been paying attention to Max Lynn or Lisa Savage. That's all the questions in the chat, I believe. Okay, Barbara is saying that kids from Central America are subject to visa. I think that's a typo, but rankings. There's some rankings for adjusting status that others are not subject to. That's, yeah. I'm not sure because I'm not representing SIDG kids anymore and haven't since I left ILAP. So if Pam or Nancy could unmute Barbara, possibly Barbara could explain that a little bit more. I don't know if that's possible though.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah.
Okay, Barbara's unmuted.
Before, all SIDG kids could ask for their green card simultaneously with asking for special immigrant juvenile status. All at once, kids from Central America were put into the visa bulletin rankings. I think they're either F2s or F3s, but SIDG kids from other countries are not. And this can result in delays in their getting their green card of 2 or 3 years sometimes.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I did not realize that they had stuck SIDG kids from Latin America into the visa bulletin.
That was actually my question, Beth, and I just wondered, why do you think that distinction is being made?
Anybody's guess. I mean, there's a lot of policies that are being targeted at Central Americans. I think one, and again, Barbara can chime in here, but I think one logical thing is because of all, there's a very, very high number of unaccompanied minors who have come over the southern border over the years compared to people coming from other countries. So yes, we have SIDG applicants from Africa, but just the volume of people, of youth that have been fleeing gang violence and whatnot, and who are able to walk to our border as opposed to kids who have to get on a plane to get here. The volume, I assume, is much, much higher. I haven't actually researched it to look at the data, but I'm assuming the volume is much, much higher. And as a result of that, and there are in our statutes per country limits on the number of people from different countries that can get visas. And so maybe they were looking at Central America is usually part of the worldwide list, and they don't normally have a separate list, but maybe they felt like they just had to create a separate list because there were such disparities in the volume. That would be my guess. Again, Barbara, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, it's a mystery to me as well. I assume it is a mean-spirited deterrent.
Yeah. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, you guys can move on to your dinner earlier than you thought.
Not a lot.
But
What can we do? So I'm planning on going to vote, obviously.
mm-hmm.
But what else can we do? Realistically, what can we do?
It's so funny because with COVID, that's become a more complicated question, because I do think, I mean, even for myself, I'm old enough that I'm like, am I going to be volunteer to work at the polls? In the past, I've actually volunteered to drive people who wanted to vote in person. And it's like, is it safe to be, for the other person or myself, to be in a car? So I do think there's a little bit of a different thought process. I know that campaigns and like the Maine Democratic Party and the national organizations are looking for people to send text messages, looking for people to make calls. The biggest thing seems to be making sure you talk to people in your friend and acquaintance circle and just kind of make sure, are they registered? Are they planning on voting? Encouraging them to vote. If you have people in your friend or family circle that are, going to, I can't disguise the fact that I believe we should be voting for Biden here, not for Trump, if one cares about immigration or the planet, and so many other things. Actually having conversations with, folks that who you think might be leaning to not voting at all, or leaning, are undecided as to whether they would vote for Trump. I mean, I think of my parents who, neither of whom are alive, but both of them were moderate Republicans lifelong. And if they were still alive, I'd be saying, "Hey, mom and dad, can we talk? How are you leading?" Because I think they would be very troubled about voting for Donald Trump, both for who he is and for a lot of his policies. But I think they'd also be worried that, Biden, and if the Senate takes control, then, unilateral government, and that might just be too much. And so, they would be worth talking to. So if you have anybody like that, that being said, I've got, cousins down in Georgia who, I'm not going to try to talk to them because I know it will be wasted breath.
Yeah, I have some relatives closer to home.
Yeah.
In that same boat. Thank you so much.
But
I
sure,
really appreciate it. This was wonderful.
sure.
Did
I
you
wish
have some-
I wish the news weren't so depressing. Again, even today, literally over the last couple of months, there have been things coming out, every single week, often multiple times a week. And that's not even really including all the court decisions, including a rule that, was published today that will make certain people who are applying for asylum in the courts, if this rule were to take effect, it would mean that they would have to file their asylum application within 2 weeks of their first hearing. And then it also creates a new standard for what is a complete application. It's virtually impossible to do a complete application in 2 weeks, particularly if you don't have a lawyer, which most of the people who are in proceedings do not, in removal proceedings. So, it's just, there's just new stuff all the time, none of it good. And really a lot of it just unimaginable. And the thing that is in some ways fascinating, if it weren't so awful, is this is the work that is being done by this administration is truly the work of the most highly experienced neurosurgeon with the steadiest hand with a scalpel. This is not throwing an axe at something. This is precision. They are finding things that if you weren't in the weeds of immigration law, you wouldn't even know existed. And like immigration lawyers who do part-time immigration law don't know that this stuff exists. And they're finding this stuff and they're changing it. You know, these obscure policies and procedures that are in policy manuals somewhere. They're not regulations, they're not statutes, and they're finding them and they're changing them for the worse.
Right.
So it's really, you know, if I were to be dispassionate about it, I'd say they're doing a fabulous job. It's really rather terrifying. They're doing it so well, but it is terrifying because it's very malevolent. In my opinion, it is entirely racist. They're targeting the diversity visa lottery. They're targeting, you know, family-based immigration because there's an inference both that they might be lower income. So there's a class element there as well, but also it's mostly, you know, people of color. When you look at the statistics on who is coming, ever since the amnesty in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, which vastly increased our, you know, our Latin American population, and then the onset of the diversity lottery, which allowed more Africans who had never been able to immigrate before, particularly more Africans to come and get their green cards and then their citizenship and then file for their family members. You know, the numbers of Asians and Africans and Latinx people who have immigrated has really grown. And, you know, I think there is a real fear of you know, us not being a white majority country anymore. And that's what's driving much of this. But the reality is all of these people, you know, drive our economy, both at the manual labor level and at the PhD researcher level, or at the create a new high-tech company level. You know, we need them all. Regardless of where they came from. And you know, people have asked me in the past, particularly because I, you know, had been doing immigration so long, you know, what is it about immigration that appealed to me or how it had me stick with it? Because as Barbara knows, you know, again, I've been at it a very long time, even if at this point I'm no longer representing clients and I'm working on policy. You know, and the answer for me is always, you know, working with immigrants and just realizing how few people are actually able to get up and leave everything that's familiar behind and start anew in a place where even if you have English, you're still going to be at sea for a while, starting over. You know, that there's a drive and a spark and a gumption in immigrants that, you know, just makes it wonderful to work with them. And immigrants come in all stripes. It's not like every immigrant has a halo and never makes a mistake. And, you know, I would never say there's no such thing as an immigrant who commits crimes, because that's, you know, there clearly are. But nonetheless, you know, immigrants have been for centuries people who are survivors, and who revitalize our society. And it's wonderful to sort of be a part of that. And I think, again, we need to do our one vote. Don't vote more than once. That would be illegal. You know, we need to exercise our vote and try to do the best we can to have a good outcome in November.
Thank you. On that very same note, we have a forum coming up on October 14th with the League of Women Voters. Anna Keller, the executive director's theme is protecting voter rights for Maine immigrants. And So that'll be October 14th at 6 p.m. I also wanted to ask folks who are still in here that they should please expect a questionnaire about the forum in the next couple of days. And wanted to once again thank Beth so much for sharing with us. It's really a very select group that knows what's going on with this because it is so complex. So we really appreciate you sharing with us.
Sure. Well, again, I
So
appreciate the
much.
opportunity, and everybody go vote and cross fingers.